Ladies and gentlemen, if I could call your attention, please. Welcome to the special called meeting of the Danville City Commission. The hour is 3:31 and change. All guests, welcome. We're here because you're here, and you're here because we're here. We're minus one commissioner who I believe is going to join us late, Denise Terry, so she'll get here as soon as she can. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our city manager, Mr. Ron Scott.
Thank you, Mayor. Let me add my welcome to you for being here this afternoon. You've had some conversations previously with our city engineer regarding the scope of our project and what we are seeking from a firm. Without belaboring that point, let me just welcome you and in the interest of time, ask you to begin with your presentation as to why the Walker Collaborative would be the firm, and with the associated firms that are with you, that would best meet our needs as we begin this process.
Okay, well, thank you. And can everybody hear me well? Yes, sir. All right, thank you very much. Well, we're excited to be here and appreciate the opportunity. And let me, now do I need to aim that or, there we go. There we go. Whoops, overdid it. So anyway, our team, as the slide reveals, I would be the lead consultant if we're fortunate enough to be selected, along with Common Ground Urban Design and Planning, which Keith Covington is here to represent that firm. Integrated Engineering with Eddie Mesta is here. And last but not least, Randall Gross Development Economics, Randy Gross. And they'll each give you a little bit of background on themselves. And so let me start off. So I am a native of Louisville, Kentucky. I was born and raised there. In fact, the first time I was ever here in Danville. Yes, sir.
Phil, can I put you on hold just a second, just to make sure our reporters got time to?
Sure.
You good? Thank you.
I'll stutter. So the first time I was in Danville, way back in 1980, I was actually being recruited by the Center College track and cross country coach, that big powerhouse, running school that Center was, I guess, at the time. But it was kind of neat, and I've been back several times since. My wife and daughter and I love to go to Shakertown, so when we go, pass through Danville, oftentimes stop and have lunch and so forth. So I've definitely been here many times over the years, which was the appeal. When I saw about the RFP, I said, we got to go after this one for Danville. So I've got about over 30 years of experience in planning. Most of that has been as a consultant. I've been with a couple of firms in the Northeast, moved to Nashville in 1995, and started my current practice back in 2002. But I've also spent time in the public sector trenches, and I always say that I think every planning consultant at some point in their career should have the pleasure of implementing a plan prepared by a planning consultant, because if you actually have to implement a plan, you understand where the pitfalls can be with downtown master plans. But I was the downtown director in Pensacola, Florida, and in Natchez, Mississippi, I was a planning director, but I sat on the Main Street board. And then more recently, back in 2011, I was hired by Clarksville, Tennessee to do a visioning process for them. And they realized they didn't have enough money to have a full-time downtown director, and they asked me to do it part-time. So I went ahead and did it just because it had been like 20 some odd years since I'd been a downtown director. It was kind of going back to school. So it was an exciting opportunity to spend almost 3 years doing that. And I authored the American Planning Association's book on downtown planning. And poor college students at many universities are forced to read it. It's required reading. I also say that, doctors sometimes prescribe their insomniac patients the book, glass of milk and a couple of pages right before bedtime. It'll put you right out. But anyway, so that's my background. Keith?
Yeah. Sorry. But I will say that everything that is ours in that book does not put anyone to sleep. We do have a few things in there. I'm Keith Covington with Common Ground Urban Design and Planning. It's great to be here. I was not recruited by Center College, and this is my first trip to Danville, but the short time I've been here, it seems like a great place, and we're glad to be here. I am an urban designer, planner, and architect, and my role in this project, should we be fortunate enough to win it, would be to focus on those issues. We have a unique kind of background. I have worked for developers, I have worked for municipalities, but prior to starting my own company in 2006, I worked for the Metro Nashville Planning Department in their design studio. So I've been on both sides of the table. I have been, as Phil just mentioned, one of the folks that has had to implement some of the planning and design work that I've done. Since starting my own company, I've had the great opportunity to work across the country in a variety of projects, many of them downtowns, and some of that work has been featured in nationwide publications, including Phil's book, some of the processes that we have run. So we're excited to be here and be a part of this team. And trying to flip it to
Eddie's next.
Yes, but it's not
Oh,
responding.
do the one on the right is the one that worked for me.
I was pushing the one on the right, but it is not advancing.
As the team leader here, let me
We're in planning, not IT, folks.
Do we have
Is it a battery?
Do we have a battery?
yeah, maybe. I think there's nothing I'm aiming at, right? This is going to kill the whole thing for us, guys. Okay.
Can we manually push it? Start keyboard?
No, it doesn't look like.
All right, there we go.
There,
Okay. My name's Eddie Mest with Integrated Engineering. Integrated is based in Lexington, Kentucky, and currently have 38 employees. We provide a broad range of civil engineering and transportation planning services. We're pre-qualified with the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet for traffic and transportation, and have done numerous projects, bike and ped projects, and have had a long history of working with Danville. Earl, it was probably over 20 years ago when I first started in engineering. I worked on the Danville Lowe's project way back when, and did the traffic study on that way back in 1998, I believe. And since that time, did a project for the city back in the early 2000s for the closure of Martin Luther King, for the expansion of Ephraim McDowell. So we did a downtown traffic study. And traffic studies with advances in software have come a long way since then. A lot of neat things that are going on. Most recently, I've assisted me and David Moses with Integrated Engineering, the city of Danville, for the East Danville connector and the West Danville connector, doing some conceptual plans for those. And also pertaining to the city of Danville and Boyle County, currently working on completing the design of a trail project, an LPA project. So about 20 years of working with the city of Danville, and we're excited to be here today.
Great.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Randy Gross. I'm an economic and strategic planning consultant, and I am based in Nashville, although I've had offices in Washington, D.C. and Johannesburg, South Africa for many years, and so I work globally. And I provide a broad range of economic and strategic planning services. So that ranges from real estate market analysis, forecasting the potential for development, different types of development, retail, office, housing, et cetera, industrial, as well as financial feasibility assessment of development to make sure that we have financially viable projects. A lot of my work is in economic development, strategic planning for business and economic development and tourism development for municipalities and local governments. I also complete a lot of fiscal impacts and economic benefits types of analyses for municipalities and for developers looking at the impacts of their projects and plans. And finally, a lot of my work is strategic planning. So I don't just produce numbers. Part of my job is to produce something that solves a problem. So marketing strategies, financing strategies, how do we implement projects and make them work? So that's a big part of what I do. I've worked for about 33 years as a consultant throughout the United States and around the world, as I mentioned before, about 600 and so projects. In Kentucky, I've been working for many years. I don't know if you're familiar with the Wellington mixed-use development up in Lexington, but I was the market consultant for that in the early 1990s, so I'm aging myself here, but worked on that. Recently in Middlesboro, Kentucky, right on the border of the Cumberland Gap National Historical Park. It was a question of how to create a gateway into that park and how to revitalize downtown Middlesboro. So a big part of the work that I did was looking at how to create that gateway feeling coming into the park, and certainly that was part of the branding of it, which we'll talk about in a minute. And more recently in Hopkinsville with Phil as well on a downtown plan there. Have worked downtown revitalization and downtown strategic planning is a big part of my work. Over 100 or so downtown projects worldwide. I also work with a lot of college towns, and I know you have a fantastic college here, and I think that's a real asset. And certainly I've worked with a lot of colleges, but also with the universities themselves in strategic planning and helping them, guide them in terms of their future. A lot of my focus in downtowns is on creating destinations and leveraging the market to get what you really want in terms of downtown. So understanding what the market potentials is key to understanding how to leverage that and to get the types of business development or the development, real estate development that you want. So obviously part of that is determining economic and financial viability and identifying projects that can be implemented. And again, a lot of that involves strategic planning and creative problem solving. Next.
All right, it's working.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Randy. Well, I guess the first thing we want you to know is that we've all worked on large projects in large downtowns. And just one example, these are two projects I've led. I led the Music Row plan back when we came up with this idea of a roundabout that's become kind of an iconic focal point, and that was back in '97. And then more recently, well, not that recently, about 2000, I led the Gulch Master Plan, and actually Randy and Keith were both involved with those. And that's turned out to be a big success. However, we've worked on big projects in big communities, but that's not real relevant to you, in my opinion. So I just wanted to kind of get that out of the way and talk about things that we think are more relevant, such as working in small downtowns in Kentucky. Here's a list of some of the projects. Most recently, Hopkinsville, where Randy and Keith and I worked. And I'd say that the biggest thing about Hopkinsville, there were a lot of ideas that came out of the strategy that we put together, but one of the biggest was to convince them not to tear down historic buildings for parking lots. There are other ways you can deal with parking. You need buildings to have stuff inside of. That's kind of the brand, you might say, of a downtown is historic buildings. So anyway, that was a major thing that we had to kind of emphasize in that project. We also, as Randy mentioned, we have a lot of experience in college towns. And here's just a list of examples. Fairly recently, just a couple of years ago, Keith and Randy and I worked on the Oxford, Mississippi comp plan, citywide plan, but we had a big focus on downtown. Same thing with Starkville and Blacksburg, Virginia. Randy's worked on a gazillion college town type projects. And by the way, I don't know if you consider yourself a college town, but I would. When I look at sort of the size of the school versus the size of your population and the impact that the university has, then I would call this a college town. Just a few years ago, well, back in 2012, we were hired to do a downtown plan for Russellville, Arkansas. And in fact, Arkansas Tech University paid for part of the budget because even though they're almost a mile away, they wanted a stronger connection between downtown and the university. So we did a plan for El Paso Avenue. They actually implemented that plan, and you'll see that slide right there where it has a cycle track and sidewalks and so forth. That whole corridor is kind of redeveloped as a major link between downtown. That picture on the upper photo is we did a visual simulation in our 2012 plan to show how you could take a historic bank building that was terribly underutilized and revitalize it, rehabilitate it. A developer got interest in doing that. They turned it into a sports bar, 57 screens, and it's totally changed the dynamics of their downtown. Now they actually have a parking problem that we had warned them about before. We were then hired 5 years later to do an update in 2017. So that's a great example of, I think, college town experience. Now, in your RFP document, there's a bullet point list of specific issues that you want the consultant team to address, and I've got them listed here. So the next set of slides are going to talk about each one of these, showing some experience, relevant experience we've had on the issues, and then followed up by a set of principles. And let me start off talking about a unified vision for downtown. That's obviously something that you want to get out of this project. And a few years ago, I was hired by Topeka, Kansas. Topeka is the state capital there. One of the problems in Topeka is that they have 10,000 state employees go to downtown every day, and guess what happens at 5 o'clock? They leave downtown. So we were looking for a way to revitalize Kansas Avenue, and I was hired to lead one of the 3 different charrettes they did with the public. And we got people so inspired and with a collective vision that they quickly allocated $5 million to actually implement some of the ideas. More recently, in fact, right now, I'm still working in Holly Springs, Mississippi, where they didn't have the same thing with Tryon, North Carolina. In both instances, they didn't have the budget to do an actual master plan, so they wanted to really create more of a vision. So I'm working in Holly Springs right now on that. They'd like to do a downtown master plan as their next step. Back in 2015, I was hired by Tryon, North Carolina, to do the same thing, to create a vision. My biggest recommendation was they needed to hire a full-time downtown director, a Main Street program. They did that. They've had great success. They invited me back just literally a few months ago to kind of give them a 5-year checkup, and we did this charrette process with the public. So we've had a lot of experience kind of creating the vision. And as far as principles go with a vision, first of all, you need to emphasize transparency, not like some communities, translucency, transparency, where everything, people know what's actually happening. Be inclusive of stakeholders. You need to use a range of methods to get public input because, some people might go to a public meeting, other people won't, but they might take a public opinion survey on the internet. So that's why you need to have a lot of different types, methods to get public involvement. You need to also develop at the front end a set of very broad objectives or principles, we often call them, that everybody agrees on. And that way, when you get into the weeds of the details, you can step back. If there's a big debate going on, step back and say, well, let's revisit these principles that everybody agreed about. And then finally, you need to create high-quality graphics that convey the vision. But a lot of, if you look at that photo, that's Midway, Georgia, where I led a plan. We basically deputize the public participants to be planners for the night. And we break them up into teams, and they come up with their own ideas. And some of the ideas we get are pretty good, and we can, work with them. A lot of times the ideas are not feasible, right? But it doesn't matter because if you get people involved in a hands-on way, they get a sense of ownership in the project, and then they want to see the plan completed and they want to see it implemented, which is what we're all about, right? Implementation. So anyway, I think that's one of the biggest takeaways on visioning. Keith, you're up.
So another identified issue is aging streetscapes, and that might even expand itself to thinking about, are our current streetscapes in Danville meeting the needs of the future, and how do they meet the vision of the community that comes out of this effort? Phil's talked a good bit about our recent work in Russellville, Arkansas. I just want to focus on one of the very first projects that came out of that downtown plan was improving their Main Street, which was a state road, very difficult to cross, almost became a barrier between the two sides of downtown. And so one of the first initial projects was to make sure that we maximize the parking along the edges of that street and do things at the intersection to actually improve the pedestrian experience in crossing that. And that was one of the key things that came out. Of course, he mentioned El Paso too, the connection to the university there. That was an important project that also has been implemented. We have had the great opportunity of working with the city of Peoria on a lot of their downtown work for years, actually dating back to 2006. Some of our more recent work there was working within their downtown warehouse district, where they received a Tiger grant for the main street that runs through the warehouse district, and really wanted to work on how do we improve that street to make it something where adaptive reuse and redevelopment could occur. It involved the idea of a road diet, the idea of being able to reduce lanes where it was appropriate so that they could maximize sidewalks, so that they could expand that as public space, even outdoor dining and so forth. And And the important thing, and one of the reasons why we were brought on to that, because it was an engineering-led project, was that as planners and urban designers, we were able to look at things, not only what's happening within the right-of-way, but what's happening at the edge of it, and how does that impact what happens there. So, some of the principles that you want to consider when you're thinking about your streetscape is, obviously we want to do everything in a downtown, but we have to prioritize. So how do you, through this planning process, prioritize connections between key uses or key public spaces and so forth? Also, sometimes funding is limited. So where do we get the best bang for our buck right now? Is it at intersection improvements, for instance, where we can improve the pedestrian experience in crossing the street, or is it in other things? And then obviously, while streetscape projects in and of themselves do not necessarily fix a downtown, they can help to incentivize development. Developers see that there's a public investment there, and that makes them want to do things to their buildings, or in the case of infill, do those projects. And so, again, streetscape shouldn't just be the only thing that you consider, but looking at it in the broader scope of things. And what did I just do there? Okay, there we go. Okay, public spaces, another thing that was identified in the RFP. This particular project is in Wilson, North Carolina. It was part of a downtown study that the Walker Collaborative and Common Ground did as part of a larger comprehensive plan. And this was a situation where the community wanted a public space where one did not exist now. And it became part of the plan, and the city latched onto it, and they actually started to make it happen. Whirligig Park, which is named after the artwork of a local folk artist, became kind of the focus of the park. But the park has been implemented, and since that time, the investment in downtown, especially around that area, has significantly increased. So public spaces can help to generate that. Another project in North Carolina, Wilkesboro, North Carolina, a much smaller community, they had some city-owned land in the heart of downtown that they wanted to create a public space, but they knew that it had to be a flexible space. They knew that they needed parking, but they wanted to create a farmer's market. So in that particular instance, we had to look at how we could create a space that served several functions, and that has been implemented and has become a huge success for downtown Wilkesboro. And then finally, we just recently completed a downtown plan for Natchez, Mississippi. Not much has been implemented there yet because it literally was just adopted. But one of the things we want to mention is, in particular, if you know anything about Natchez, the old Spanish parade ground, which is the bluff on the top of there, that is an existing public space. But in some instances, it needs to be enhanced. So it wasn't about creating a new space. It was about how do we maximize that space and make it better for the community. So, public spaces in general, some of the principles behind that is you want to make sure that you right-size the public spaces for the end user. You need to think about who is going to be using that space, how that space is going to be used, and make sure that it's appropriate for that. And then, of course, it's not just about, just doing a whole bunch of new spaces. I mean, sometimes it's about enhancing the existing spaces. You also need to think in terms of special events and how those might be impacted and how that can play into the design of a public space. And then, of course, one of the most important and critical things is when you do have public spaces, whether they're existing or whether they're new, making sure that you actually have active uses around those spaces to help activate them and make them a comfortable, inviting place for pedestrians. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. Yes.
All right, now it's time for the boring civil engineer to talk. You got to have them on the team, right?
That's right.
Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about the two P's here, pedestrian safety and public parking. And vitally important component of the project, and I'm going to talk about a couple projects with y'all. The Pikeville Streetscape Master Plan, we're the current consultant engineer for the city of Pikeville, and one of the projects that's been derived out of that is called their 2D district. And I know it's a little hard to see from the aerial, but basically that's downtown Pikeville. The convention center's on your bottom right. U-Pike is off the picture there to your left. But it's a narrow one-way old street. You can see the photo in the bottom right, and they're in the process of revitalizing that. And one of our jobs right now is to do a streetscape with that. And there's a lot of energy going into downtown Pikeville. Alltech has built a Dueling Barrels distillery. There's a theater. Lots of good stuff going on down there. But one of the things we're focused on, I'm going to share a little more about it later as well, but is road diets, trying to calm that traffic down, trying to squeeze the lanes a little bit, just so it's safer for your pedestrians. Talking about mid-block pedestrian crossings, things such as that. The project to your right is certainly more of an implementation of a project, but it's important. The sidewalks with pedestrian safety, that's the Tates Creek Sidewalk Project for LFUCG that I managed. That was a very, very public project, a lot of public meetings, a lot that went into that for the retrofit of that sidewalk. And when you get into these sidewalks, you know, retrofitting infrastructure to get it for ADA is a difficult task. You've got a lot of buildings, you got a lot of things that go with it to implement the project. Another relevant project downtown, it was for Frankfort, Kentucky. They are getting ready to go to a two-way street conversion from one-way to two-way. Construction will be going through on that here later this fall, early next year. But a big problem with that and getting everything to work out was delivery trucks and truck turning, things such as that. And obviously downtown Danville with Main Street, there's a lot of trucks, a lot of heavy vehicles that go through. That's something we need to be thinking of, and how we can divert that traffic and make it safer for our pedestrians. That's a big component. And the primary principles for pedestrian safety is that the pedestrians and cyclists should be on equal footing with drivers. They should be, we should have proper buffering for them and give them the most of safety. On-street parking is important as a physical and psychological barrier between pedestrians and motorized traffic. So you've got to allow for that component of the parking. The intersections, pedestrian bulbs, crosswalks, all those things are in play and are very important for pedestrian safety. Parking system management, getting back to Pikeville. And Pikeville has a lot of common denominators with Danville. You got U-Pike with Pikeville, obviously Center College with Danville. And Pikeville recently, within the last 10 years, built a new parking garage. You all within the last year, Danville's built a lovely new parking garage. So there's a lot of infrastructure already in place that we have to our advantage here in Danville. The city of Berea, we assisted them 2 years ago with a comprehensive traffic study in downtown Berea, and that was done collaboratively with Berea College. Berea, obviously with the college campus, a lot of pedestrians. We had a lot of focus group meetings with Berea College, and we did our traffic study. We did a simulation. What you see on the right is a micro simulation of the Boone Tavern area in Berea. I'm sure many of y'all have been to Berea. But that triangle right there is an absolute traffic nightmare. And trying to get that fixed and figured out is quite a challenge. But we took into account pedestrian counts and everything that went with that. So the primary principles for parking system management is the parking for downtown customers should be convenient to their destinations. We want to keep on-street parking. Yeah. Maybe we look at, instead of parallel parking, maybe there's room for some angled parking to make it easier on the motorists to pull in and pull out. That's something that we could be listening to if that's available. On-street parking should be regulated for turnover every 2 or 3 hours. You all already do an excellent job of that. I see signs all over town, 2-hour parking to allow that turnover. The parking for employees and residents should be off-street in the lots and garages. Again, you have a very, very good, large parking garage here in downtown. And you need to tell the general public where those parking facilities are. So on-street parking should be maximized, and historic buildings should not be replaced by lots, as Phil said earlier. All right.
You know, I love it when the civil engineer thinks he's the boring one, and then I'm the economist.
I did
Thank
that
you.
too.
I appreciate that. So don't fall asleep yet, okay? We got a little bit more to go. Expansion of downtown was one of the issues you identified in your RFP, and so we wanted to address some of the questions and experience related to that. And what I always like to say is your downtown should grow with your community. So the downtown area is an incredibly important part of your community. It should represent, it's the face of your community in a lot of ways. It's the heart of your community, and so it should grow and reflect the growth of your community as you expand as well. Plus, from a marketing, from a business development, economic development perspective, companies are looking for places where their employees want to live, and a lot of workers want to live in a place that has a vibrant downtown, that has restaurants, that has places to go out to eat, places to do things, and younger workers want those kinds of places, and seniors want a place where they can walk, et cetera. So downtowns are becoming more important for economic development. So expansion of downtown is a critical part of that. One of the projects that we worked on not too long ago was, Phil mentioned the comprehensive plan for Starkville, Mississippi. Following up on that, the city hired us again to look at expansion of downtown along the Martin Luther King Highway 182 corridor, which is just outside of the traditional downtown core. And that area had seen disinvestment over many years. It had seen a lot of vacant properties, and there was a need to revitalize the area, to incorporate it into downtown, and to celebrate its heritage and its historic past. And so part of that was looking at how to infill buildings, how to integrate that community or that corridor into downtown and make it more part of the destination potential for downtown. Another project similar to that was in Bristol, Virginia, or Bristol, Tennessee. And Virginia, as you might know, the Tennessee-Virginia state line goes to the middle of Bristol. In fact, the main street is called State Street, and on one side is Virginia, the other side is Tennessee. And one of the questions there, again, was expansion of the downtown area. And a lot of downtowns have a periphery of surface parking lots, and that's certainly something that Bristol had and something we looked at, but it was an important part of the question there as well. Some of the principles behind expansion of downtown, first and foremost, you want to make sure that your existing building space and new infill development is prioritized over outward expansion. So we want to make sure that your downtown, your existing downtown properties are well utilized, that you don't have a lot of vacancy, which I don't think you have a lot of vacancy in your commercial space here, but you want to maximize what you have first. But beyond that, the market potentials can help drive those questions of where and how to expand downtown. In other words, what is the market support in terms of expansion, and where and how should that happen in a way that is sensitive to the surrounding areas of the downtown? Areas to expand into might include where land and buildings are already underutilized, as I said before, vacant or underused surface parking areas, for example. Areas to avoid expansion might include natural and man-made barriers, such as streams. Here you have a large rail yard, rail lines, and so that might be a barrier to expansion in that direction. So those are the kinds of things that you have to consider. Another question that you had in your RFP was about outdoor dining, and this is an area where we've had a lot of experience. One project, for example, that I worked on was in Alexandria, Virginia, which is the home of George Washington, just outside of Washington, D.C. Old Town Alexandria is a traditional main street, a very popular tourist destination. But the very narrow streets and sidewalks were keeping pedestrians from, there was a lot of mixing between pedestrians and traffic, and then you didn't have space for outdoor dining. And so one of the solutions that I helped them develop was a way of, and this may sound horrible to shop owners, but taking away one or two parking spaces in front of a business only with the express permission of that business, mainly restaurants, who were happy to give up one or two parking spaces in order to gain 12 tables of seating for their restaurants. And that exactly is what happened, and they're very happy with it. That picture on the bottom left shows you the result with people seated outside along the street where they took away a parking space in front of their own restaurant. So that's an example of a successful solution. Downtown Bristol, where we just mentioned we had been working on a downtown plan, the north side of 6th Street has the best ground floor frontage for restaurants, we determined, and it's quite a quaint area of the downtown area. So there was an effort to redesign the street by moving on-street parking to the other side to provide a buffer from the restaurants to the pedestrians. And also this street was a linkage with an anchor project that we saw as a helpful way of expanding downtown in this particular case with a baseball stadium in that particular location. So some of the principles for outdoor dining. One thing to keep in mind is that downtowns are becoming, and this is what's happening with retail in general, brick and mortar retail, is there's an entertainment factor with retail today. And downtowns can be a hub for that kind of activity, and that helps keep downtowns very vibrant. So outdoor dining is a form of entertainment. It contributes to an animated downtown, a lively downtown, and creates a destination for people to come downtown. Downtown dining is a growing market. More and more people want to eat outside. They want to eat downtown. So that's an important market for us to look at. Dining on sidewalks in front of buildings requires sufficient sidewalk width, as we mentioned before. So that's an important part of the question. Locating it adjacent to buildings or curbs is important if on-street parking exists. And delineating those spaces in terms of having gates or iron railings, this type of thing, even temporary ones, is very important to separate the diners from the pedestrian walking. I believe, one more topic related to the RFP, which is branding and wayfinding, which you identified as a question or an issue. Some of the projects where we've worked on this include Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is outside of Washington, D.C., and there I completed a retail market analysis and a marketing strategy for them. What they've done is they've taken some of their historic emblems, like a rooster that was associated with the history of Tacoma Park, and they changed the rooster for different types of events. So it's an iconic image that they're using as part of their marketing. What was key to their marketing was the diversity of the city, and so they used that rooster to convey that through their marketing and branding. Middlesboro, where, as I mentioned before, I worked on their gateway treatments and their downtown sort of revitalization adjacent to the historical park. The branding was related to the historical park. You can't ignore the fact that a national historical site is right on the doorstep of your downtown. So naturally, the assets that you have are something that you have to work with. Okay, some more about wayfinding.
Yep, and we're getting towards the end, so appreciate your patience. On wayfinding, we mentioned we had just finished this downtown plan for Natchez, Mississippi recently, and they wanted wayfinding to be addressed. And when you think about it, there's kind of two types of signage with wayfinding, and one is peripheral. And for example, this kind of a sign, you're just trying to get people to the downtown, right? So we came up with a map and we showed these locations outside of downtown on the edges of the community where it would be a good spot to put directional signage to downtown. Then once people get inside the downtown is where you have the internal wayfinding, which is that example on the far right where you could actually have a consistent design template, some kind of a color coding based on the different themes. Be sure to use a consistent logo like we've shown there, and then some kind of an attractive pole. And just to kind of wrap up both what Randy addressed on branding and me on wayfinding, when it comes to the principles on branding, it's really all about determining what is the strongest identity for your downtown, and then how do you convey that in a clear manner. And in most cases, it should be something that's inherent to the downtown. In other words, it's part of the history. It's not something that has to be contrived, right? And oftentimes the branding will even drive, the tenant mix, the marketing, logos, the kind of events you have. With regard to wayfinding, it's not just signage. It should be part of an integrated system of maps and web-based resources, phone apps, that sort of thing. And then, thinking in terms when it comes to the signage between peripheral and internal. And when I first saw this listed on your RFP of branding and wayfinding kind of in the same breath, I thought to myself, well, they're really very different things. One's branding, it's identity. The other one's about getting people around. But there actually is an overlap, which we pointed out. Just that one graphic shows that even in your wayfinding, you can figure out ways to get the branding to come out, right? Whether it's your logo or whatever. Event management's another thing you had in the RFP. And it's funny because the first job I had when I was a downtown director for Pensacola, Florida, one of my responsibilities was to organize events. I was amazed in my files to find these two flyers on events from the mid-1980s, right? Well, I told you I took that opportunity in Clarksville to kind of be a downtown director again. 27 years later, I was again responsible for organizing special events. You know, everything from lining up the bands, getting sponsors, lining up security, dealing with insurance. I even, you know, half of the chairs in that picture on the right, I carried myself. So, you know, when you got to do a plan on special events, you actually had to organize them yourself. It helps give you some insights into that. So the principles with regard to events is that, you know, before you start to initiate new events, first of all, figure out ways to improve the events you have. Also, you might have had events going on that have migrated outside of your downtown that you can lure back to downtown. So that's another thing to think about. Also, you have to think about who is the intended audience here? Who are you trying to attract? You know, that's a big part of what kind of events you have. And also, don't be surprised if businesses during the event don't have increased sales. In fact, they might even have lower sales. And I remember all the time hearing merchants say, well, gee, you know, we have these events and people come in here and they trash the downtown, they leave it dirty, no one spends money in my business. And we say, think long term. You may be attracting people that rarely come to your downtown. They go there, they have a positive experience, and sure, they may not spend money that day in your business, but 2 weeks later, they may come back. So you gotta kind of look at the big picture. And also prioritize quality over quantity. You don't want to be perceived as kind of a budget basement type of downtown. You know, always think quality. Finally, I'm going to be real quick on the approach. Just one slide. We went into a lot of detail on the scope. But, you know, there are basically 4 parts. There's the project kickoff and research. The charrette's the most kind of intensive public input component of the whole thing, where we come up with the big ideas. You know, it's a multi-day. I think we proposed 4 days here to do that. Then once we get the initial feedback from the public on what they like, what they don't like, we go back and we produce the plan document, submit it, it gets reviewed, we make revisions, then we come back and present it for yet another round of public input, and then revise it again. Now, we're flexible on the time frame. We came up with an 8-month time frame. That's probably pretty reasonable. If it has to be quicker, we can do that. But the plan should answer 4 basic questions. Where are we now? That's, you know, what are your existing conditions? Where are we headed? That is, what are the trends? And those 2 things really align with task 1. Number 3, where do you want to go? And that's especially task 2. It's like, what's the vision of the people? What do people want their downtown to be? And then finally, how do you get there? That's the actual plan document. That's where the technical part really comes in on figuring out how to get you where you want to be for downtown Danville. And of course, we had a budget with that. The base scope was kind of the low end. What we see is kind of the minimal effort needed. We had just under $70,000. Final slide. So why do we think that our team is a good fit for this project? Well, first of all, when I put together a team for this kind of project, I look at what are the issues, and I put together a multidisciplinary team that represents everything. I tend to think in terms of the Main Street 4-point approach, you know, organization, design, economic restructuring, and promotion. Actually, it's now economic vitality. They changed it a few years ago. So I think in those terms, and our team reflects those issues. Secondly, this is a planner-led team. You know, I've seen some teams do projects like this that might be led by an architect, for example, or led by an engineer, or, gosh forbid, an economist. But, you know, they say the specialty of a planner is being a generalist. And the good thing about having a planner-led plan is that it's balanced. It looks at all the different issues and the different disciplines, and it gives a more balanced view. My primary focus is downtown planning. I do lots of different types of planning. I do comprehensive plans, but in particular, I do downtown planning, which is why I wrote the book. We specialize also in stakeholder engagement. I've been trained and certified by the National Charrette Institute. We have a lot of college town experience, which we talked about. Public sector implementation, as we've talked about, having to actually implement the plans of planners. A lot of private sector perspective, especially these 3 guys that don't just work for municipal clients, but also developers. And finally, we beg you, please talk to our clients because our plans actually achieve results. So with that, hopefully we got lots of time for Q&A.
Thank you, gentlemen. Commissioner Terry has joined us, so I wanted to make sure that she was properly introduced. Questions?
Yeah. First off, thanks for coming, and that was a very thorough presentation because you actually answered several questions I had during the course of it. And one that was of particular interest is you've heard about the potential for the change in downtown as far as the traffic pattern goes, and you've probably heard something about a desire for more walkability, particularly sidewalks down in this area. And I'm sure you've run into that before, but could you just speak to it a little bit?
Sure. When you look at downtowns, historically, they were always two-way streets, right? Then roughly the 1950s, 60s, traffic engineers, and they reformed, thank goodness for Eddie, but you got traffic engineers, and they had one interest, that's moving vehicles, motorized vehicles, as quickly and efficiently as they could. So suddenly you get all these, historically two-way streets, and they're turned one way. Well, there are a lot of problems with that. First of all, people drive faster on a one-way street. They don't have what they call friction. That is, traffic coming the opposite direction. So that's an issue, people speed. There have been studies showing that when they convert back to two-way, retail sales can go up. Now, we've heard different stories on that, but a lot of times there is more visibility when you have two-way traffic that way. You also eliminate out-of-trip driving. In other words, if you have a bunch of one-way streets and you want to get over here, you got to go a block, take a right, instead of going the most direct route. And then finally, if you want to have more tourists, the last thing you want to do is confuse them and maybe irritate them by having a lot of one-way streets. So as a general principle, we recommend that you at least explore converting your one-way streets to two-way. Now, we also realize from a technical point of view, and that's something that Eddie will be addressing, that sometimes you can't do it for whatever reason, but you need to at least pursue that. And in a lot of our plans that we've been doing, we've recommended that they convert from one-way to two-way. Yeah, please.
And specifically, about sidewalks. It's a balancing act, right? I mean, one of the things that we're running into when we're working with downtown plans, you sometimes you have a constrained right of way, and so you're trying to figure out how to balance the needs of the pedestrian, the motorists, the cyclists, even in certain instances. And so it's not about as one of the slides mentioned, it's not about favoring one or the other. It's about putting everyone on equal ground. But that means that everyone has to, give a little. And that's where, road diets can come in and be helpful. Other, routes and good wayfinding and things like that can help disperse traffic in a downtown so that you can then go back and retrofit some of those streets to improve sidewalk width. Anything else related to streetscape, whether it be trees or furnishings and things like that, it becomes a huge part of it. I know in the Peoria project, that was a big thing for us because that Main Street, Washington Street in Peoria was still a main truck traffic route. And so we were balancing a lot of different things with that, but we were able to do it and increase sidewalk.
Yeah. The other thing, one more question, I'll pass it to somebody else, is we recently saw a couple of alternatives that the state is offering for our Main Street, and I assume that will be available to you guys. And one of them has bike lanes and one of them doesn't, and I'll be interested to see after you study it what you think might be the best alternative there.
Okay.
So Commissioner Sayers here. I'll echo Commissioner Caudell's. Thank you all for coming in. It was a good presentation. Segueing off of his comments, the striping will happen before we hire a group like yours to come in. And so I think a hot topic right now is the bike lanes and the restriping of downtown. I would ask for a comment where you've been before when some of the buzzwords were road diet, et cetera, et cetera. What have you seen, and what have you seen be successful when it comes to bike lanes on Main Street downtown?
Yeah, and I'm going to turn it over to Eddie, but let me just throw in my 2 cents worth before, and that is, bike lanes, what I've noticed, especially we looked at this issue in Bristol, Tennessee / Virginia, and what made the most sense there was that where you're going to have designated bike lanes, and I live on a street, by the way, that has a designated bike lane, so I'm real familiar with how they work versus on-street parking and so forth. And the peripheral streets just outside of downtown that feed into downtown were the ones in that instance that were best fitted for for bike lanes. And then when you really got into the downtown grid, the real core, it turned out that you didn't have the space, and you wanted to be sure to keep all the on-street parking you can get. And with all that, it was just a matter of letting cyclists integrate into the driving lanes. But that was the experience there. But Eddie, do you have anything?
Well, a good example of success, and one that's going to continue to get even better, is Euclid Avenue, University of Kentucky. They had a road diet that was completed probably 10 or so, more than 10 years ago, where they took it from 4 lanes. I think it was 4 10-foot lanes down to 3, then they added bike lanes. That's been very successful, but one thing that's going to get better with it is with the new streetscape that we're involved with as well. You got to look out for your intersections, because you're giving the biker a lane, but then you've got to make sure that that car coming out of that intersection, that's very well known. So you've got to do some bulbs. You've got to do some features that slow that biker down a little bit. Maybe put a little bit of a turn in it or something like that. Just add some geometry to it, just so you don't get those conflict points. But there's a lot of good examples of it now. Another one that's going on is Town Branch Commons in downtown Lexington, which is down Midland and on Divine. They're doing basically a linear park going down into downtown. So it's definitely it's a good movement for that. And by doing the road diets and taking your lane maybe from 12 to 11, even down to 10, the driver, it slows them down. It's a traffic measure.
You've never seen my wife drive, but that's okay.
And, you know,
And another thing too, I know there's talk about the connector and whatnot, but to also be able to get that percentage of heavy trucks out of that corridor.
Yeah.
You know, we had lunch at the hub before coming over here, and golly, another truck after another truck after another. I mean, lost count. And so being able to divert that traffic, because you know when you're in a big dump truck, you're not gonna see lights. But that's a big component.
It's that balancing act, you know. We just recently completed a planning project in downtown Chattanooga where, you know, we had a street that was a major connection between a school and an area that was being redeveloped. And in a good portion of the corridor, it could accommodate the bike lanes because the width was there. But once it got into a more urban area, they had to go to sharrows. So the bike the striping and the bike lanes converted to that. And again, it's about balancing, and it's about signing it the proper way. So,
thank you. Other questions or comments? Now I can roam around. Thank you. I thought it was glued there, you know, and I just kind of clung onto the podium. Now I can be
Talk
like
to
a
me a
talk
minute
show
about
host.
opportunity zones. It's something that we have been targeting now for about 6 months. And we've not had much progress or success. So are we trying to push a string up the hill? Is this going to be one of those conditions where money flows into the big cities at the expense of smaller communities? Give me your thoughts here.
You know, I just happened to bring my economist with me on this trip.
So you have a designated opportunity zone?
We have a rather large designated opportunity zones, one of the more unique opportunity zones in the United States.
Why is it unique?
Because for a community our size, I think there were only 4 places in Kentucky chosen.
Okay.
And it's a fairly significant amount of land.
Okay.
With a lot of interesting possibilities.
Right.
All things can be done with money.
Oh, that's true. One thing I've learned about opportunity zones already is that they provide an incentive for investors who already know that there's a market for something someplace and that there's a project that will work financially, because they only benefit from the incentives if they are going to make money from it. Mm-hmm. It's not a leveraging tool the way that some other incentives are. In other words, to attract someone into an area that has disinvestment. It's more of a benefit to people who see a project in an area where they can make money, and then they get the benefits from it. You see the difference? And so a big problem that you might have is in marketing the district and in identifying specific projects that could be economically and financially viable. So we'd want to know what the market can support, what its potential is, and then what kinds of projects can we pull from that to identify specific opportunities for marketing the zone.
So without putting words in your mouth, it sounds as though what we're attempting to do here would play nicely into this entire opportunity
Yes.
zone effort.
Yes, because if we're able to identify the projects, then we can actually help you package them in a way and even identify the potential market for those, to say, here are the types of developers or investors who might be interested in this kind of project. So you just make that connection to the projects. Now, I think the market analysis, that kind of work is an optional task. So we're not doing that as, it would be an option if you chose to do that. Right. Looking at the existing conditions. So we're not really looking at the potentials. If you chose to do that, that's something we can do. Wonderful.
That leads me into my next question. So you gave a minimal figure. I've often found that if you pay up a little bit more, you get a whole lot more value for it.
Right.
That said, and with a market study that included our opportunity zone, care to venture a cost estimate?
Yes. So when we had the budget in there and it came in just under 70,000, it was tied to the whole scope that we listed up until that point. So everything in there, and of course we work on a fixed fee, fixed expenses basis because it helps local government's budget easier. It's not like we're going to bill you for any more than what's in that budget. But we also recognize that there are other things that would be very helpful to you that are beyond that base scope. So we had a list at the very end of the at the very end of the proposal, right after the budget page, of additional services. So the very thing Randy was just talking about doing, let's say a retail/commercial, page 18, market analysis, that would be in the, what was it, $10,000 to $15,000? Yeah, $10,000 to $15,000 range. Looking at the housing market strategies would be, I think it was roughly the same, maybe 10,000. Yeah. So we always put those in there because the way I approach these, I say, okay, what at a minimum needs to really happen? And that's what we call the base scope. But then I think, gosh, it would sure be useful for them, helpful to do some of these other things. I mean, one example I think was the key graphic that's not very expensive. It's literally, $1,500, $2,000. But if you don't do, one of those great graphics where you hire an artist or some, computer simulation person to do the image that sells. I mean, I still swear that the music row plan I did way back in Nashville, 1997, we came up with this great concept, but we didn't have money in the budget for a good graphic. And I went to the city and I said, hey, can we have $1,500 to hire an artist? Nope, don't have it. So I went to the property owner that owned the most property there, and I did a song and dance, and he says, Phil, how much is this going to cost? I said, $1,500. Pulls out a piece of paper, wrote, I owe you $1,500 for artist rendering, hands it to me. We hired the guy, did this great rendering. When we presented it with then Mayor Bredesen, next day, top of the fold, front page of the Tennessean was that rendering. And now it's there. It's an actual place. And I still say that $1,500 might have been the difference between it happening or not. So those are just some examples of things that, could be really helpful, including, Randy's work on an opportunity zone.
We had an economic development plan done and completed about 2.5 years ago by, you're familiar with that, RKG? Okay. So that might help in terms of not reinventing that wheel.
Right. And we could give you, if you tell us, hey, we really want to look at this optional service, we can pinpoint the dollars and more of a scope, too, beyond a paragraph description.
I don't want to hog all the questions. Anybody else? Jay, you got any questions?
No, I'm good.
Denise? Then I'll continue. So what has been your most challenging project and why?
Most challenging. Well, there's one and it wasn't a downtown project, but it was a planning project not long ago, and it was in a county outside of Nashville, and it was for an area, areas that are kind of rural, ex-urban, suburban, and they're seeing a lot of growth. You get a lot of friction between people that want to keep it the way it is, keep it green, and others who are fine with seeing growth occur, right? So I went to the client at the very front end of the project. I said, look, I could tell they didn't like to have a lot of public meetings and have a lot of public engagement. And I said, I totally understand. It's a natural human instinct not to want to be around, friction, people that are being negative towards you. But you got to embrace public engagement. You got to just literally embrace it and say, we're going to be as transparent and get as much public input as we can. I told them, otherwise it'll come back and it'll bite you. Well, they didn't really listen. And so they didn't promote very vigorously the public meetings. We had some turnout, but not like it should have been. So we put together a plan. It was a really good plan. It went through the Planning Commission, was unanimously approved by the Planning Commission. Then it was just going to go to the County Commission for adoption. Well, one guy who didn't know about it, a property owner, found out about it and felt like he'd been, hadn't been pulled in and inclusive, even though they'd done newspaper articles on it. Long story short, he didn't want to see anything change at all, so he kind of misrepresented our plan to the public, and it withered on the vine. They just basically had to take this plan and put it on a shelf. I mean, that's probably the worst, by far, experience. And the moral to the story is embrace public engagement. Don't hide and try to avoid
We have
it.
no shortage of that in this community, I
bet.
promise you that.
Especially in college town.
My next question you may have just answered, and that would be, what has been your most disappointing project and why?
So I don't know if disappointing, sometimes stuff doesn't happen. It just, you come in, you do a plan, and the community just doesn't have the wherewithal to be able to implement it. And we always have a lengthy implementation section in the back of the plan. We go into detail. We really think through implementation. We try to make it realistic to the resources the community has. And I did a plan for this little town, Midway, Georgia, which is south. I always joke it's midway between nothing and nothing. It's south of Savannah, a little bit outside of Savannah, and it just didn't have a lot of economics behind it. It was a small community. And one time, my wife and daughter and I, this is a few years ago, we're going to Savannah, and we had some time to kill. We're on I-95, and I said, hey, do you mind if we pull off? I did a plan for this community about 10 years ago. I want to see what's happening. So I pull in there, and there was some new development, and the quality was much better than it was before, but not a whole lot. It was still a small, little, modest town, And after this little quick tour, we get back on the interstate. My daughter says, 12 years old at the time, she goes, Dad, your plan's not very good. And I'm like, well, it's not like you flip a switch and the plan, So that was kind of a gut, when your daughter says, Dad, your plan's not very good, just based on her observations out of a car window on a trip.
So there's a new term I've learned here called a charrette.
Right, yeah.
So
let me explain it.
Yeah.
A charrette, it's something that has roots in sort of the design planning community from years back, and it's become much more popular the last couple of decades. What it really boils down to is that you, in our scope, it would be the second task, where once we've done all the background research and we've gotten a certain level of public input, and we have a pretty good feel for what the study area is all about, we'll come here for 4 days, and on the first evening, we have a public workshop, and we'll present in a PowerPoint our findings, so everybody knows, here's what we've learned about your downtown. Then we take everybody, you may have 100 people, we hope, maybe even more. You split people up into teams of maybe 8 to 10 people. Each team is at a table. Each table has a base map of the study area and a set of colored markers. And we, like I said before, we deputize them to be planners for the night. And we walk them through a process where each team comes up with its own plan. And it usually takes about an hour, hour and a half, that part of it. And then at the end, everybody reunites, and we'll get 1 or 2 spokespeople from each team to present their plan. And it is the most dynamic, engaging process. People thank us. It's like we provided them a night of entertainment. They're like, thank you so much. And what comes out of it is first of all, we usually learn new things that we didn't know. There are sometimes some good ideas that we can take those ideas and we can kind of run with them. Now, there are a lot of ideas that are not viable, and we're very polite about those. But what's maybe more important than anything is that people have hands-on involvement with the process. And when they do that, they have ownership. And if they have ownership, once the plan's adopted, they want to actually see things happen. So maybe 6 months after the plan's been adopted and the city commission is going to vote on funding a particular project, they're the squeaky wheels that come out because they feel a sense of ownership, right? So that's what a charrette is. Anyway, that was the first night. Yeah. Then, that's the exciting part. Then after that first night, the next 3 days, we spend almost around the clock putting together the, quote, concept plan, the big ideas. And on the final evening, that is day 4 in your all's case, we present to the public the concept plan. And it's still a concept, and we emphasize that this is our first stab. We want to get your feedback. We have lots of time for discussion after we present the concept, find out what they like, what they don't like, and that's when we go away and put together the plan document, and then you can see the rest of the scope.
I just want to add something about the charrette because we use it in our own work. We do a lot of work with the Walker Collaborative, but we do a lot of projects elsewhere, and we're big fans of that approach. It's about feedback loops because you're constantly trying to make sure that you're hearing things correctly from the community. So after that first night, when we start roughing out just a basic direction, the very next day, if there's a project steering committee, we'll meet with that steering committee. Hopefully they were at the visioning session too, and we can say, okay, here's what we heard last night. Here's the direction we're going. Are we can we confirm that direction? And then we get that information and we start using that. The other thing is we're in the community for those, for that short period of time. And while it's, intense and there's a lot of work and, not a lot of free time, it's easy for us, especially me as a designer, to be able to get out into the community and see something if I'm looking at it and producing some concepts for it. So it's a very useful tool for us. And again, as Phil just mentioned, having the presentation at the end, it's more of a work in progress because we're still getting feedback at that point.
Okay, just one more question, Mike. We have as most towns do, I guess, have a comprehensive plan. Planning and zoning comes up with a comprehensive plan. Do typically your plans conform to that, or do you come up with a plan and then maybe try to work with our planning and zoning director about tweaking the comprehensive plan, or how does that typically work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we'll do is we'll review your comprehensive plan and understand it, but we will not feel like our hands are tied unless you tell us otherwise to whatever is in that plan as far as how it treats downtown. We'll look at the downtown master plan as sort of the authority on your downtown. And then once you adopt that plan, you adopt it as an element of your comprehensive plan. So we do that all the time where we're, we'll do a downtown plan and it becomes part of the comprehensive plan. It's treated almost like another section or an addendum. It just occurred later than the original plan.
So just to be clear, should the Walker Group be hired for this project, the faces we see today are the faces we would see tomorrow?
Right. Yeah, we're one-person firms, so, well, no, I take it back. He's got some help, but yeah, it's not a bait and switch. It'll be us. Yeah, which when you look at bigger firms, a lot of times they have folks who have 4 or 5 years experience, and they're just someone's kind of looking over their shoulder. But you actually get us, which makes we think for a better end result.
I guess, Mayor, I have one question, and that's maybe to Phil. You've worked in this business for 30 years, and you're obviously very excited about the possibilities here and the other communities that you've also worked in. Do you think that now is a much more opportune time than in earlier years to come up with an effective downtown master plan that really can be implemented through TIF or whatever financial resources might be available as opposed to 10, 15 years ago?
Absolutely, and I can't even speak so much to just say financial tools that are out there. I mean, Randy can speak to that. But if you just look at trends nationwide, I'm just blown away by how many small communities with downtowns are revitalizing. Whether it's a bigger community like where we live in Nashville or a small town, people just think differently, and more, especially younger people, millennials are wanting to move into urban areas. They don't want to, and empty nesters, they don't want to keep up a yard and have, all the maintenance issues they have to deal with. They want to be able to walk to a restaurant. They want to be able to sit outside. I mean, it's just, it's great because forever I was working in this environment where it was an uphill battle to revitalize downtowns. And now it's really starting to happen. It helps to have a plan, obviously, so you can direct how everything happens. But we're starting to see market forces that play into what we've been trying to do for years. Randy, do you have anything to? Okay.
Back when Earl and I were in school, nobody went downtown Lexington. Nobody. And now the Distillery District, downtown Branch Commons, Fifth Third Pavilion, Cheapside, I mean, it's an amazing trend, not only regionally but nationally. You see it virtually in every community. Now Pikeville, as I noted, same thing. The 2D district they're doing right down 2nd Street. It's pretty common everywhere.
I have a question, and since I was a late arrival, you may have already answered this in your presentation. What about implementation and also helping us to identify what area may be eligible for a TIF or how we would fund this in phases?
Right. So implementations are really, really important part of a plan. It's usually the last section, and it includes a couple of things. One will be like narrative pieces that deal with things like, if you're looking to do TIF or something like that, how that might occur. We also have an implementation matrix, which is basically a spreadsheet that has all the key ideas from the plan grouped by issue category. And we'll first of all just kind of summarize, here's the idea. Here's the page numbers in the plan. It's great because it's only 1 or 2 pages, and you can look at it and go, oh, between pages 57 and 60, they talk about how to do outdoor dining. So you can go back and reference it. It'll say who the responsible party or parties are, and that's important, and then a time frame. And usually we'll split it up into, short-term, mid-term, and long-term projects. Short-term may be within the next year. And oftentimes that's kind of low-hanging fruit. For example, there may be zoning. We'll look at your public policy. We'll look at your zoning. And so in the implementation section, we look at our plan and say, well, what has to change with the zoning to implement this plan? And we'll make really specific recommendations. So, and that's usually not real expensive to do something like that. So it might be a near-term project. And then others that are kind of bigger, maybe they require more money. Maybe there's some sequencing issue where it makes sense to do it later. Those will be in there as well. So it's kind of a combination of narrative text that talks about these ideas in detail, and then this matrix. And by the way, we always recommend you have a project steering committee for this, that you appoint representatives to kind of steer it. But what's even more important is at the end of the project, they put on a new hat as the implementation committee. And usually along the way, you'll discover some of the steering committee members maybe weren't as active, and maybe they kind of fall off, and you discover new people through the planning process and add them on. But that implementation committee should meet at least once a month. They should be staffed. I mean, somebody needs to be shepherding the plan implementation along. And I'll tell you how it works is they'll be sitting there in their office, they look at the schedule, they go, oops, the implementation committee's meeting next week. I've got to make some progress. I got to move the ball down the field a little further, right? And that's how it gets done and maybe an annual or even every 6 months, an update to City Commission on where implementation stands. So implementation's a really important part of this for us because we actually like to see our plans get implemented. I think we worn them down.
No, we're just being nice.
So you decided not to come to center and run, or
Oh, I'm sorry?
you said you came down here, you were going to run for center?
Right, I was being recruited and came down here, had a great time, and ended up going somewhere else, mainly just for the program. I got my bachelor's degree in historic preservation, and where I ended up at Middle Tennessee was the first bachelor's program ever in the country in historic preservation. That's what kind of got me into downtowns and city planning. So,
I'm asking because was it track or cross country?
well, it'd have been both.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was a cross country coach at the time. Maybe you didn't like the coach.
No, I don't think so, because I remember this. This is the funny part of the story. Halfway through my freshman year at Middle, I get a call from the guy, and he checking to see if I was happy at Middle Tennessee. And I said, well, yeah, I am. And I said, how come? He said, well, he had left the Center College, went to Mary Washington College in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and they had just started a preservation program. And he remembered, oh, Walker, that kid from Louisville, that's what he's studying, preservation. So the guy checked. So that's why I know it wasn't you. That's the only reason I knew that.
It was Rick's father, probably, but that's okay. I just want to say, I had 4 questions written down before I got here, and I appreciate the fact you guys answered all 4 of them in your presentation. So, great job.
Thanks. All right. Well, listen, again, we really appreciate the opportunity. I've always loved Danville. I love this part of Kentucky. Like I said, we come visit Shakertown periodically and usually stop in at Danville. And when I saw this, I said, there's some projects you got to go after. That's how and I'd love to be doing your all's plan. It would be a real honor. And I think we could do a lot to help you get down the road. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate your time, your travel, and safe journeys home.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Nice meeting you.
Our pleasure. If there are no other comments from staff, I assume they're not.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Motion is made and seconded to adjourn. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. We'll see you later tonight.